Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sydney, and if you're new here, this is just a place where we can talk about true crime, spooky, scary stories, dark history, or anything else I got going on in my brain. So right now I'm in the middle of working on a little bit of a bigger project, and I really wanted a break. So I decided that today we are going to be talking about some ghosts, and not just any ghosts, but ghosts that live in one of the most famous buildings in all of England. So without any further ado, let's talk about the ghosts of the Tower of London. I'm so excited. So if you're a dumb American like me and you don't know very much about the Tower of London, let me break it down for you. This castle stands on the banks of the River Thames in central London, and it was built in 1078. So like such a long time ago, by this guy named William the Conqueror. William built this because he thought that this would be the perfect symbol of the Normans' power and prestige. It was a defense against the Vikings, but it also just showed their power. And the first structure that was built out of this castle was named the White Tower, and it was built completely out of limestone that came straight from Normandy. Over the next few centuries, as you might imagine, they kept expanding on it, and now it spans over 18 acres with 2 protective walls and even a moat, which is fucking badass. I love a moat. And of course, throughout its time, it served many different purposes. From its construction to about the 17th century, it was home to many of the royals and their courts, and specific buildings had different purposes. So of course, the Lion Tower was home to the menagerie. They had all different kinds of exotic animals living there. And the towers also served as a very popular political prison, and prisoners would either be executed on the Tower Green or on Tower Hill. But of course, that's just scratching the surface. Throughout different parts of history, it served as an armory, a treasury, a mint, a public records office, and even held the English crown jewels at one point in time. And of course, with all the hustle and bustle going on in the Tower of London, there are gonna be some spooky, scary ghosts. So we are gonna be talking about 3 of the most famous right here, right now. Let's get into it. Let me just say before we get into this first story, I love the UK. I wanna go there someday, but god damn it. Back in the day, everybody had the same name. Okay, it was just like, everybody had the same name. You just add a number after it and then you're good to go. You have a brand new unique name. So it's gonna maybe be a little confusing. I'm gonna try to keep everybody straight, but you better keep up with me, okay? It's not my fault. These people all have the same exact name. The year was 1483 and King Edward IV had just passed away and the throne was up for grabs. Now, naturally, the next few people in line would be King Edward's sons. So he had a son, a 12-year-old son named Edward V, and he also had a 9-year-old son called Henry. Now, King Edward IV also had a brother, and his name was Richard III, Duke of Gloucester. His role in all of this was that he was supposed to help Edward V go into the throne, understand the role, and help make decisions until Edward V felt comfortable. So back then it was tradition that whoever was coming into power would stay at the Tower of London, and for Edward V it was no different, and he got to the towers on May 9th of 1483. Edward was supposed to take the throne on May 4th, but for unknown reasons it was pushed back to June 25th. But Edward didn't have to wait all by himself in the towers. His 9-year-old brother Richard came and joined him and stayed with him, and that happened on June 19th that he came to join his brother. But on that day, June 16th, Richard III, the Duke of Gloucester, he decided that they were going to indefinitely postpone crowning King Edward. In the following days, a lot of the powerful people in the area, knights, lords, religious figures, they started spreading the news that King Richard was the only true-blooded candidate for king. It was actually decided that the 2 boys were illegitimate, and this was because King Edward IV, he had a first wife before he married the mother of his children, and that made Edward and Richard not true members of the royal family. And this left Richard III, the Duke of Gloucester, the only real legitimate choice for king. So on July 6th of 1483, King Richard III was crowned. The boys who were once seen roaming and playing around the towers were seen less and less after Richard became king. In fact, they were moved from their quarters to these inner apartments within the towers. A doctor who would sometimes visit Edward V said that he, much like his father, looked very close to death. the doctor reportedly said, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. Before long, people realized that the brothers had completely disappeared, and most historians believe that these two young boys were murdered. In fact, two child-sized skeletons have been found within the Tower of London, but DNA has yet to confirm if these are the young princes. But if we're to suspect murder, then we should look at the suspects, and the most obvious one is, of course, King Richard III. He could only benefit from these two young boys dying. I mean, he was not that popular when he became king, so he could very easily get overthrown, and if, one of the boys wanted to, they could become king. It was still possible. There were a few rumors swirling around that the boys were about to get rescued from the towers. And this wasn't too far-fetched because their mom was actually staying out in the countryside, and so she could very easily get a group of people together and they could just raid the towers, get the boys, and get out of there. And if they were to be let free, who knows what would happen to the fate of the throne? Again, King Richard wasn't very popular, and he could very easily be overthrown if enough people got together and tried it. It was, and continues to be speculated, that a knight named Sir James Tyrrell was commissioned by the king to kill the young boys. It would have been quite easy to do because the people guarding the boys would have been employed by King Richard, so the knight could have easily slipped by without anybody really batting an eye. Another suspect was Richard's second in command, and his name was Henry Stafford. He could have benefited a lot from the boys being dead because with them out of the way, he was next in line for king after Richard III. If this was the case and Henry did murder the two boys, it was all for naught because he was actually executed in November of 1483. And you might be like, what? Why? I thought that he and Edward were besties, right? Like, what's going on? Well, there was a bit of a falling out between the two men, and this ended in an unsuccessful rebellion against King Edward. It's unclear why the relationship between the two went sour, but it's speculated that the princes in the tower have something to do with it. Some think, like I stated before, that Henry took the initiative to murder the two boys, and Edward was not happy about it. The other theory, though, is that King Richard still murdered the boys, but then when Henry found out, he was upset and he was like, I can't really do this anymore. You're just being a little bit too intense. You've murdered your nephews. So a couple different theories, but all of them ended with Henry's head in a basket. So who knows? And the last and most optimistic theory is that the boys were indeed rescued from the towers, given new identities, and lived the rest of their lives peacefully in the countryside. That theory doesn't hold a lot of water to me, though, because there have been several accounts of two young spirits seen throughout the towers, holding hands and playing together. Laughter can also be heard sometimes throughout the battlements and throughout the halls. Other sightings, though, do point to some potential fear that the young boys might have had towards the end of their lives. For example, many guards have seen these two young spirits walking down the hallways together before disappearing. And other times people have seen these spirits huddling together as if they're very scared of something unseen. People who have seen these spirits say that when they try to approach, the spirits kind of like back up and disappear. So my theory is, of course, that these two boys were probably murdered by their uncle to make sure that his reign could keep going for as long as he lived. Sad fucking stuff, man. All right, let's move away from child death, if you don't mind, and let's talk about Lady Jane Grey. So she was actually the granddaughter of King Henry VII, and she grew up in a home with the tools to make sure that she succeeded both academically and religiously. She was very loyal to her Protestant religion. When Jane was 14 years old, her dad, also named Henry, Henry Grey, he was appointed the Duke of Suffolk, which meant that she was now officially part of the royal courts. At the time, Edward VI was in power, but he was only 13 years old, so a lot of the decision-making was up to John Dudley, who was the Duke of Northumberland. And so at age 16, Lady Jane Grey was married to John's son, and his name was Lord Gifford Dudley. Around the time that Jane and Guilford got married, Edward VI kept getting sick a lot. He was getting a lot of fevers and coughing fits, and so as time marched on and the future was looking kind of bleak for Edward, John Dudley realized that they were going to have to find a new successor. pretty quickly. The natural choice was to have one of Edward's half-sisters take the throne, and their names were Mary Tudor and Elizabeth. But the problem with that was that they were both pretty strict Catholic, and Edward was a Protestant. So John Dudley was kind of like, we should keep this bitch Protestant. We should, we separated ourselves from the Catholic Church. We kind of want to keep it that way. So he was kind of looking around for somebody who was Protestant to take the throne. So in something that we can see is kind of becoming a pattern, John Dudley convinced Edward to label his half-sisters as illegitimate, which left his first cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to become queen. Scandalous. So when Edward did eventually pass on July 6th of 1553, Lady Jane Grey was crowned queen, and this was much to the dismay of Mary Tudor and the majority of the population, because they wanted Mary to be the queen, not this random Jane Grey lady. Even Jane's own father, Henry, slunk away from her side to join Mary Tudor, and so within 9 days of being crowned, Jane decided to give up her position to Mary. As you can probably imagine, Jane, her husband Guilford, and her father Henry were all arrested and held at the Tower of London as political prisoners. Although it should be noted that Henry was pardoned. He just seems like a little snitch to me. I hate Henry Grey. All my hoes hate Henry Grey, okay? Get it straight. Jane and her husband were sentenced to high treason for going against the monarchy, even though she really didn't have any say in this. She kind of gave up her role without too much of a fight. Mary Tudor was kind of just that bitch, She was like, nah. You fucked with the wrong lady. And so they were both sentenced to death. At first, their sentence was suspended, but then there was this whole conflict that fired up Mary's hatred once again. I'm not going to go into it too much, but basically Queen Mary wanted to marry this random Spanish dude. And this random guy was like, no, you cannot do that. So this started a rebellion against the queen. And Henry Grey, Jane's father, decided to take the side of the rebellion. And when the rebellion failed, Mary was like, dude, what the fuck? You're arrested again. You're sentenced to death again. Get in there with your skank daughter. So this time Mary wasn't fucking around. She swiftly had Jane and Lord Guilford beheaded, followed later by Henry. She just didn't want this family around anymore. Get out of my life, she said. Kinda don't blame her at this point. So Lord Guilford was executed first on the Tower Green, and they carried his headless body past Jane's cell, and she had to look at it before her execution. Not pleasant, to say the least, but Jane Grey was brave, even when facing death. Allegedly, on the chopping block, she said, "Please dispatch me quickly." I'd be crying like a little bitch. You wouldn't believe it. I'd be screaming and hollering and begging for my life, and she's just like, get it over with, please and thank you. What a bad bitch. Since the couple's death, Lady Jane and Lord Guilford's spirits have been seen multiple times all around the Tower of London. Jane is most often seen walking along the high walls of the battlements, or sometimes gliding across the Tower Green. The sightings are more frequent on or around her death date, and there's one account from 1957 where a guard was standing post at the Salt Tower when he heard something hitting the roof above his head. He quickly ran up to the battlement to see what was going on, and he saw the spirit of Lady Jane, obviously headless, and she was just meandering down the aisle. But her spirit does seem to get around, because she has been seen a couple of times near her home in Lancashire. Apparently on Christmas Eve, her carriage, being pulled by 4 headless horses, will pull up to the ruins of her home, and then she will descend out of the carriage, holding her head, of course, and then she'll disappear into the ruins of her old home. Lord Guilford's spirit is really only seen within his holding cell, which was located within the Bouchat Tower. Sometimes you can hear him crying, and it's also thought that he is responsible for carving the name Jane into the side of the holding cell there. All right, let's move from talking about one bad bitch to the other. Let's talk about Anne Boleyn. So she was born in 1501 to very powerful parents in Kent. And when she was just 13 years old, she went to both Austria and France to be on their royal courts. Here she was able to obviously rub shoulders with elites and learn very important skills and manners that would set her apart from her peers once she got back to England. By the time she returned in 1522, she was able to sing, dance, play musical instruments, and she was up to date on all the latest French fashion trends. Both Anne and Mary ended up getting a seat on the Royal English courts, and here is where she caught the eye of King Henry VIII, okay? Now, it's important to note that King Henry was already married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon, and together they had a daughter together. But Henry had this deep-seated fear that his wife was not going to be able to give him a son, and he needed a son to carry on both the crown and his family name. Now, any peasant off the street could have seen that Henry had this fear, and this included our girl Anne. So instead of becoming the king's mistress when she had the opportunity, she declined and decided to play the long game. And it worked, because by 1526, Anne and Henry were writing each other all the time. The king was confessing his undying love for Anne, but Catherine was still in the way, okay? She wasn't going down without a fight. I wouldn't either. If I was Catherine, I'd be like, who does this girl think she fucking is? Get out of here. Henry didn't fuck with that, though. He went straight to the Pope in 1527, and he was like, hey, Pope, listen, my marriage, it's not even cool. Like, God would not like this, because Catherine was married to my brother before she married me. So, like, that's not cool, right? And the Pope was like, no, God is totally fine with that. You're good. You don't have to divorce your wife. And King Henry was like, it's not the answer I was really looking for, but okay. Frustrated, Henry and Anne tried to find a loophole, and they did in this book called Obedience of a Christian Man. It stated that authority was held by God in the Bible, not by the Pope. Henry went so far as to completely disengage himself from the Catholic Church and ended up eventually sending Catherine away in 1531. Anne and Henry got married in January of 1533, although this marriage wasn't actually true because Henry and Catherine were still married until May of that year. Anne was crowned queen in June, and then on September 7th, they had a beautiful baby girl together, okay? And Anne was a ride or die. She supported everything her husband did. But of course, things were not all happy and rosy, because after they had a daughter, they kept trying to have another child because Henry really needed this boy, okay? And it seemed like no matter what they were doing, Anne just kept having issues. She kept miscarrying, all of this stuff. It was no bueno, okay? It was bad. It was bad. And I have to imagine back in those days, it was like,
the woman's at fault. It's her womb. She has a defective womb. She's the devil. Throw her in the garbage can. It can't be King Henry. It can't be his sperm. Oh my goodness. It has to be the woman's fault.
You know what I mean? Not a great time for a woman. Reports stated that Henry's superstitions led him to believe that marrying Anne was against God's will, and this was just all of the karma coming back at him. He would not be able to have a son because he went against God by marrying Anne. Not only that, but Anne was a little bit more rowdy than Catherine was, okay? Like, she was going to sit back. If she thought something, she was going to say it, no matter the consequences, all right? So it was at this point that King Henry VIII started looking for love outside of his marriage once again. And I really talk about this guy because he wasn't important up until this point, but there was King Henry's chief minister, and his name was Thomas Cromwell. Okay, and Anne and Thomas got along and were kind of cordial up until a point in 1536. They started to butt heads a little bit because Thomas had made this sale of monastic property, and he decided that it should go back into the royal family, but Anne believed that it should go for education and charity, like give it back to the community. And Thomas was like, you're silly. No, I'm not doing that. And this is when things started to go downhill for Anne, because Thomas and the courts, at the request of the king, no doubt, started to spread these accusations that Anne was cheating on Henry. All in all, 7 men, including Anne's own brother, were accused of getting busy with the queen, although most of the powerful figures were acquitted of their crimes. On May 2nd of 1536, Queen Anne was arrested and held within the Tower of London. 10 days later, she had a trial where she was charged with incest, high treason, and adultery. It came out during the trial that Anne and her lovers were planning to kill the king. There wasn't any real evidence for this, any kind of concrete findings, but it didn't really matter, because she was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. Imagine that, a real plot twist, huh? But the ever-so-kind king did convert her death sentence from a burning to a beheading, and also from a commoner's axe to a skilled swordsman. He is so nice. Oh my god, he's a keeper. And again, much like Lady Jane, she seemed to be in high spirits right before her execution. The night before, she was quoted as saying, "I heard the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Iconic. What the heck? On the morning of May 19th, Anne was taken out to the side of the White Tower where an impromptu scaffolding had been built for her execution. She addressed the crowd saying, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." She then said her goodbyes, a few prayers, and with a single stroke of a sword, she was deceased. Anne was a fucking badass. Not even being like, my husband was a shitter, dude. He was a shitter. She stood by her husband until the very last minute. I mean, she was like, he's a good lord, he's a good guy, I'm in the wrong. Like, just pray for me, okay? I'll be fine. I'm gonna be fine, okay? That's... God, these women, I can't even deal with it right now. Crazy. It should be no surprise that Anne's spirit wanted to hang around the Tower of London. I mean, she ended on good terms. She was probably like, fuck yeah, I must stick around. My hubby's here. There is one account from a guard that said as he was making his rounds, he saw a flickering light coming from the usually dark chapel. He cautiously peered through the window and saw a procession of people dressed in 16th century garb, and they were being led by none other than the headless Anne. She has also been seen walking around the halls of the towers multiple times and near the area where she was beheaded. And that is all I have for you guys today. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe if you did. I really enjoyed looking into this old-timey English history. Like I said, I'm a dumb American. I only learned really like American history and that's it. This was so much fun. The drama going on in England when there were kings and queens. I mean, there still are kings and queens, but like, that shit was wild. I can't imagine. I'd be dead within the first like 20 minutes because I'd piss somebody off or I'd marry the wrong person. I don't know, but so fun. I loved learning about this. I hope that you guys enjoyed too. But yeah, I hope that you guys are having a wonderful day. I so enjoyed taking this time to sit down and talk with you about the Tower of London, and keep being the bad bitches that you are. Bye guys.